All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us. My name is John Lyons. I am the Director of Programming for the Film Society of Northwestern Pennsylvania. This is our new series for our new reality. It's called Film Under Quarantine. And our first film was Earth, which I assume you all have watched. Our panel today is, and panelists, if you could just say hello so we all know who you are. Let me Tiffany, turn your microphone back on for you. Sorry about that. So our panelists are John Vanco.
Hiya.
Tiffany Onyeiwu.
Hi.
Matthew Ferrence.
Hi.
Sarah Bennett.
Hello.
Thank you all so much for being here. So with Earth, it's a documentary, of course. The setup is that several billion tons of Earth are moved annually by humans. The film visited 7 different locations where humans are transforming the planet on a grand scale. I think scale is the big point here with the flow and the style of the film. I know the pace may not have been for everyone, and we can discuss that in a little bit here. But I felt that the pace and the style was necessary to show the magnitude and the scale of what is occurring. I found it to be mesmerizing, and once I got acclimated to that style, I felt that the extra time allowed me to kind of stop and think about what was actually being shown very subtly but powerfully. And I felt it was really quite terrifying. So I'm curious to hear what our panel thinks and what you all think as well, and get into where the story ends with the Canadian tar sands and the community shown there in particular, as well as everyone's overall messages. But before we get to that, I want to thank the distributor that helped us set up this film, Kim Stim, and our partners, the Green New Deal Coalition, who, if you didn't get to check out their programming that started today for Earth Week, we should say it's also the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. So thank you for joining us here on Earth Day. But the Green New Deal Coalition is having programming on their Facebook page for the next few days. And you can watch live on Facebook, or you can catch up if you're busy when they do have live events. And also Eco People at Meadville Area Senior High. Thank you guys so much for making this event possible. And now let's go to our panel so they can introduce themselves. Thank you, panel.
Thank you, John. This is John Vanco. I'm really happy to watch this film. I think it's a masterful film. And yeah, I understand the whole thing about the pace. I like a good action narrative too, but it was totally appropriate to the subject. And it took me places that I'd never been. And I mean that in the sense of the physical surroundings that you were in on top of those machines, right beside those huge events, explosions, the boring machine, the earth movers, etc. From a vantage point that I will never personally experience, I'm sure, firsthand. So I really enjoyed that part of it as well. But it has a profound message too. That I was struck, frankly, by how virtually all the participants who were interviewed understood what they were doing was doing to the earth. And, they had ranged from, where was it? It's the guy in the San Fernando Valley, I think, that said, there are no limits, so we can do whatever we want. he was kind of the least conscious of all of them, of what they were doing, and kind of had that kind of frontier mentality about, well, sure, we can just transform this place. Nobody's using it. uh, but a lot of them said, something like, "Oh, it's a necessary evil. If I don't do it, somebody else will." And sometimes I feel bad, but they move on. They go to work. They do this totally destructive behavior day after day. And that's a fundamental truth about that movie. That's what man is doing to the planet, and it doesn't matter that they're aware of what it means long term. It's their paycheck. I'll pass.
Tiffany.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Tiffany, and I consider myself a climate justice advocate. I work with the Green New Deal and Eco People, and some initial thoughts. I'd say I feel pretty similarly to John Vanco, but overall, I really actually appreciated the pace. I think that because it was so slow, everything else was just that much more deliberate. And I really could feel immersed in every shot of every frame, which I really appreciated, especially those like wide panoramic shots. The one at the end specifically stuck out to me. They were so beautiful, but I was really, really glad to see a viewpoint and a narrative from an Indigenous person, because they really are the guardians of this earth, and they care for, I think the numbers between 70 and 80% of the biodiversity, Indigenous people all over the world. So to see their voice represented in this film was something that I valued a lot. And like John, I really noticed how the interviewees were all very conscious of the exploitative measures that their work was doing, and yet they continued and persisted, which I think can have an underlying message about what it is that we do, knowing what harm it can cause. So.
Hi, my name is Matt Ferrence. I am the chair of the Department of English at Allegheny, and I'm also happen to be a political candidate these days running for the Pennsylvania House in the 6th District, which is Crawford County and parts of Erie County, Fairview Township primarily. My field is creative nonfiction, which is an analogous art form to documentary film. And my own writing, my last book was about landscape relationship in northern Appalachia. I grew up in Indiana County of Pennsylvania. And so and this is a frame for thinking about what we're talking about of the people in this film that I found remarkable. And so what I think about a lot and write about is how the landscape that we all live in is a landscape that's built through the erosion of an old plateau. And so there's something about our land that is related to moving earth on the natural side of things. What struck me about every individual in the film that I thought was beautiful and tragic was that not only were they aware of the destructive force of what they were doing, but they were all voicing a relationship to the land, that they were personifying the land and they were feeling connected to it. And it was often a feeling of battle. Or there was the one man in Hungary who was the cyclist, who actually had more of a fatalistic, like, this is a job I have to do, but he really sees nature and land as a way to escape from his job. And that got me to thinking about narrative and politics together, and how one of the things I'm often telling my students, or I'm saying when I'm talking about politics, is that we live the stories that we tell about ourselves, or the stories that are told about us. And you could see that they were all telling the story that they had to be antagonistic to the landscape that they were connected to. So ultimately, it's an abusive relationship that they're talking about. They've got a bad relationship with the land that they feel they have to dominate it, but they're still connected. And there's more that I want to say about that, but I'll stop there. I thought it was really interesting in a weird way, hopeful.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Bennett. I am currently the department chair for biology at Mercyhurst University, but transitioning into a full-time position with Penn Future, which is an environmental advocacy group that is fighting for our constitutional rights to clean air and clean water and preserving the environment. So with my hire, we'll be opening the Penn Future Erie office, which is the 5th office for the organization. So I'm excited that organization is moving to Erie and excited to be representing that organization here as well. So I have also been a sustainability leader at Mercyhurst, and so I'm always working toward change. And so I see this film, and I'm still kind of trying to wrap my head around the bigness, the huge, the landscape that this is. And it shows, this is not something that we often see. It's obviously something that we often rely on, but to think about, that's kind of what I'm up against, is kind of what I'm thinking. And how do you communicate that? And so I echo all of the thoughts that all of the other panelists have had so far. But I think there are a lot of thoughts about human nature that came out in this film as well. I'm going to go against the rest of the panelists and say that the length of, I agree with the length of time that it did get the point across. I do think it could have been a little bit shorter. I think that shorter periods of time would have been just as impactful as the others, or as the length that was there. And maybe even more. I made a comment earlier about environmental films needing to think about their audience and who are you trying to communicate to, and that length of time. I think there's a fine line between too long and too short. So just kind of my 2 cents there.
Yeah, I think that they would think of their audience as being the film audience rather than a specifically environmental audience. And for that reason, I think that they made the right choices about the length and the music and the whole thing. I think it's a masterful film.
Well, we have thank you everyone for your initial thoughts. We have a question that came through in the chat from Michaela. So let's just jump into the questions, shall we? And everybody remember, either type your questions in the chat or raise your hand in the chat, and I'll unmute you and we can call on you. So we've got, what are your reactions to certain locations and their workers' responses to how they're reconstructing the earth? And what landscapes in particular shocked you? And what responses in particular shocked you? Good question. Who wants to take it? John's got his hand up. All right. Nice.
Well, I'll answer the first part of it. Just an observation that my response to the people, where was it? In Switzerland or Italy, wherever they were drilling the tunnel. My response to that was different from everything that had preceded it. I thought, well, they're drilling a tunnel through a mountain. It's, yeah, it's going to have impacts on the ecology, but the people are over here and people are over here. It's making them easier to get from one place to the other. Until the woman, I think she's an engineer, she talked about how much material they were creating by the drilling process, and that, because as I'm watching, I'm thinking, oh, that's a great road building material or whatever. I mean, it's certainly, there's a positive, it's all good, right? And she's talking about, well, they have so much of that material, they're going to be filling in valleys. It's like, what? No. That's another outsized impact. That, and then not really, again, then I kind of had to put them in a category with the rest of them, like insensitive to what they're doing to the earth.
Other panelists, you guys can just jump in. You don't have to raise your hands.
I will say that the locations with the salt mines really shocked me, just that they were so vast and expansive. I think the cinematographer used the word that they could fit several large auditoriums in the pockets of spaces in the earth, and I think that was a very interesting visual. And also, like John said, how they were just dumping nuclear waste in there, and now the individuals who are stuck trying to fix that mess they consciously know that what they do will not ever stop it from fully being a catastrophe, which I think is something really hard to acknowledge in your line of work, that no matter what you do, a poor outcome will still be inevitable. That was really profound to me. Again, the scale of the Italian marble, I think that was another landscape that was really, really shocking, just to see how large and vast and how much of it there was. And almost, I guess, what shocked me from, I think it was one of the workers there who said that he got an adrenaline rush from being able to be the first person, or one of the first people who has touched this marble in millions of years, is really, really interesting. And I guess I kind of related that to the adrenaline rush I feel with activism, and how he had spoken about his work as it's something that he does that makes him live and breathe and fuels his existence. And while my work is fighting for the earth, not against it, I kind of related to that. And then I'll say another worker response that really shocked me was the woman who said, I can't recall what location she was from, but that they tried to go about mining in the most eco-friendly way possible. I thought that was very ironic, and an interesting take about the really deep level of understanding, or lack of depth, I should say, of understanding of the consequences of their line of work. So
I was really enthralled with the section in Hungary for lots of reasons, I think. Partly the orogenies of the Carpathian Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains aren't that different. And strip mining that's the landscape I grew up in, was the strip mines of southwestern Pennsylvania. And I've got Hungarian ancestry within me. So, I'm seeing lots of things coming together. But then in the cinematography there, the three characters of that section were really presenting three fascinating and therefore shocking in juxtaposition responses. You had the one operator who, toward the end, and I'm thinking about when they found the petrified forest, and that operator, I'll start with the bad one, right? He said, if we stop for every frozen tree we found, that's just going to slow us down. We're going to lose a lot of money. And then you had the other operator who seemed more melancholy about that, recognizing that it was something he had to do to feed his family, but didn't like doing because he, again, found the recharge in the mountains. And then the woman who was the director at the museum, and that terrible irony of, you're like, oh, they found this forest and they saved it. And like, no, that's the forest. There's those two petrified trunks behind you. And it reminds me, as an aside, like there's a sand dune in Ocean City, Maryland. So I used to work at Astig Island National Seashore, where there's a natural landscape, and there's one sand dune in Ocean City that's behind a chain link fence, and there's a sign that says, "This is a sand dune," and the rest is just like Spring Break Beach. And that museum in Hungary struck me that way, that that was the best that she could do. And so it was that recognition that I actually don't blame either of the operators, that this is the deal that they have. They've got to dig the coal off of that seam. But what we're losing in the perspectives that we start rationalizing out with it was really quite jarring.
And I think for me, it was all of the, the huge landscapes that we saw. So each one, I think, to me, struck me as, obviously that was the point, but that was kind of awe-inspiring to me, I guess. But the part that shocked me the most was not necessarily those landscapes, but more, and this happened both with with Hungary and the salt mine, the million years that in the salt mine, they talked about having to shore up that salt mine to create a structure that would last 1 million years, so that that radioactive material could, it would meet its half-life. And it's like that, and the person they interviewed there said that encompasses the entire human history. And I think, how foolhardy are we that we could build a structure that will last 1 million years? And I just think that speaks to kind of the vanity of humans. That
Hubris.
Go ahead.
Hubris.
Hubris, that's a great word. That I just, you can't, why would we think that we can do that? And it's almost like we're making excuses for what it is that we're doing. So that really was what struck me, and maybe it's the biologist in me and the evolution piece there. But I think that was the most shocking.
Yeah, I want to chime in on that too, because it's interesting that there was a remark by the heavy equipment operator in California where he said, growing up as a kid, playing with my Tonka toys, and now I get to be the Tonka toy. And it struck me early on in the film that part of what's happening is that the hubris we're talking about is a conditioned narrative relationship to the land. So we're actually trained as kids, like I'm thinking about my own boys with their shovels out in the sandbox in the backyard. We're actually trained to do that thing. And so it's a really easy fall, if we want to call it that, or whatever, evolution even, into that kind of excavation work, because it's naturalized. And so that struck me as part of the rhetorical difficulty of convincing people to think differently. And I see Michaela's comment in that chat line. I'm taking John's job from him. But that's part of recognizing that so many of these individuals doing destructive excavation work aren't destructive-minded people. That's what they've grown up doing. And if we can activate the love they have for the work into a different spot that's constructive or reconstructive, they actually can still play in the sandbox with their big toys without tearing the mountain down, instead shoring it up in some way.
Good point. I'm gonna jump in here. Janice says, I was especially shocked by the people dumping the radioactive waste into the well. They were glad to get rid of it, but did they really understand the destruction they were causing? Yeah, good point. I think this might be Jerry. She says, I was floored by Carrera. I never put 2 and 2 together regarding my love of ancient sculpture and the desire to have a completely marble bathroom and kitchen to what it's doing to the planet. And I think most people don't. Yeah, does anyone want to comment to the, I know Sarah, you were talking about the marble and
yeah, that was something else I was thinking about with each location was why are we doing this, and what are we using this for? And kind of trying to think about the rationalization of this destruction at each location. And the one that seemed kind of the most superficial to me was the Carrera. That Carrera marble, I mean, I know we build some things with that, but it's mostly for beauty, especially that level of marble, that quality. But so yeah, the destruction of an an entire mountain so that we can have beautiful marble seemed just unreal to me.
Well, compare that with mountaintop removal. That's even more disgusting. You're taking the mountain, instead of cutting it into pieces and adorning things with it, you're taking it and pushing it into the next valley. Yeah, it's,
Yeah, and it was interesting the speed at which, you know, the workers are saying that that we're performing these tasks now. The film is slow, but really the amount of work and the amount of marble and land that is being moved is so fast and so ramped up now, in really such a short amount of time. It's crazy. Like when they're talking about building, you know, that the place to dump the waste that'll last 1,000,000 years. I mean, our perspective, you know, then was so out of touch. And every year that, you know, we destroy the planet more and have consequences of our actions, you know, it just compounds and compresses that timeline so much. It's crazy. Let me jump into, does anyone else want to comment on those last two comments from Janice and Jerry? Anything else to say about the radioactive waste or Carrera? Stu, you said pure documentary. Do you have anything to elaborate on that? Do you want to talk about some stylistic choices? Or is that all you wanted to share? Give me a signal. Okay. And then we've got Michaela. Okay, so what are your reactions to the workers' responses, like the woman in Spain working with copper, when she said without copper we wouldn't have electricity? How do we continue on with this relatively unseen to the public but absolutely expansive reconstructive work, and necessary work?
well, I think it's a misinterpretation of what's necessary. We're extremely wasteful in our society because we don't put a value on that mountain, or you know, all the other aspects of nature. So it's cheaper to go mine more copper than it is to use what we have more efficiently and to recycle it. And that's true of materials across the board. And yeah, it's not good. I mean, yeah, there's a certain amount of mining, I suppose, that we'll have to do for quite a while, but it could be done a lot more selectively and only in the context of true need and not this perceived need driven by anti-natural forces, I would say.
I wanted to throw in too on the idea of pure documentary and the sort of brilliant storytelling of the film in making the point that John's just making. So when they were doing the strip mining in Hungary, the one operator's like, it's pretty low coal content, so we just throw that stuff out. We're going for the hardcore seam. And the engineer in the copper mine was talking about these gradations. And we can see that in Western Pennsylvania as well, as that's part of what happened, is that they abandoned coal mines that were harder to get at. And so we see that the inevitability that Michaela is referencing has a lot to do with the definition of economic benefit. And it's about the profit motive, not the conservation motive. So you could get a lot more coal out of a strip mine. I'm not saying you should get any coal out of a strip mine actually, or you could get more efficiently, a higher efficiency out of a copper mine if you cared about conservation instead of the maximum amount of money in the shortest amount of time. And in 50 years, they'll go back to the tailings pile and they'll start mining that because suddenly that becomes worthwhile. It was garbage 50 years ago and it becomes the new mine in 50 years. And that's that sort of short human time frame problem that keeps us on that treadmill of continuing to exploit a mountain and tear it apart.
Yeah, I would agree that with just echo what both of you said, but in addition to that, I'd like to add that I feel that a lot of this roots back into capitalism and the way that our world uses markets and money to make profit and revenue, and how that is always everything in our society. And I keep going back to this statistic that I hear a lot in the climate justice movement, which is that just about 100 companies are responsible for over 70% of what we see as climate change and environmental destruction, which is an incredible number on both sides of that spectrum. And I just Googled it, and the mining industry in 2018 made really close to $700 billion in revenue, which is an insane amount. And I just keep thinking if we could push that energy and time and effort into trying to revert to green sources versus exploiting the earth.
One thing that comes to mind is, for me also, is, you know, when we started mining coal, it's always been bad for the environment, but now we know, we have evidence, we have science to say exactly what this is doing to the environment. And I just think how reckless, how irresponsible it is for us to continue to do this the same way we always have. And so I guess when someone says we always need copper, to echo what everybody else said, it's so irresponsible to say this is the way we've always done it. And I think that's especially important to bring up in Erie, a place where we face a lot of this is the way we've always done it. And I'm sure Erie is like many other places. But let's use evidence. Let's examine what we know to be true and stop being irresponsible. Instead, be really smart and innovative, because that's the future. So why aren't we heading there now is really kind of where that question takes me.
I'm bringing Stu in. Stu, you had a question?
Well, mostly just a couple comments. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, just wondering because I got my little headset on here. First time using it. From a filmmaking sense, it is almost by definition pure documentary because of the way it's shot, the way the interviews happen. You know, they're not mixed up and like shot in some like leading form where the interviewee is,
Inserting themselves into the narrative.
Exactly. You know, it is strictly the subject, their response, and then these wide-scaping, pictures of the landscape, which in a sense, you know, looking at them for such a long period, which again, who is your audience? You know, who are you trying to preach to? I loved this. I thought it was great. That's why I thought it was pure documentary. But you just get so absorbed into the picture that it's almost like becomes a morphs into an artwork in a sense. And then you can see almost, it's like the little ants crawling and what have you. But so I thought that was really cool. And, you know, and everything everyone has said already, just, you know, it is just completely true. And John, the one thing about the tunnel too, I had seen a prior documentary on how that was supposed to be a train tunnel, you know, connecting the two for commerce, and not at all realizing the cons at all whatsoever until I saw this.
Interesting.
You know, everyone's like, yeah, we're building this tunnel. And I was like, wow, that doesn't seem like such a bad idea. But yeah, and then I didn't realize the downside. And then one last question, kind of sidetracking, but what is the situation with the coke plant in Erie on the waterfront? Has there been updates on that? Is it still business as usual?
It's a shuffle right now. They're doing some cleanup. It seems clear that the company is looking to expend the money that the judge forced them to escrow for cleanup and then they're likely gonna skip it. You know, they're gonna walk away somehow, the way they've done every place else.
What a surprise.
Yeah, shock.
Corporate greed. Getting back to what you said, Tiffany.
It looks like Janice Etchison can speak to that in a little bit more detail.
She could.
Okay.
Yeah.
Janice.
Yes.
Thank you.
I mean, ever since, you know, it was the mayor closed them down because due to the pollution in the water that they were sending over to the wastewater treatment plant. That was the end of December. And in January, we got back together to talk about the implications of what they had done. And we've done a lot, a whole lot behind the scenes. There have been many, many meetings with the mayor and our county executive, with the city council, with members of the county council, with the Department of Health. And I could go on even with the city planning committee. And I could keep going on. And with the thoughts of trying to envision the future, so that don't think that we just stopped the work. We really want to have an impact on what happens in the future, but our hands are tied. They are tied because the land and the business is privately owned. And until that changes, and if that changes, or if they decide to sell it and whether we would have any control over who they sell it to, you know, we have no idea. So there are good things happening in all those discussions, but there's also the frustration because it is privately owned. And we've talked to great extent with the people in Tonawanda, New York, where they also, you know, that Coke plant in Tonawanda was owned by the same group of people, and they just abandoned it. And it's now a super fund. And our taxes, well, people in New York State or the EPA or, you know, whatever, will have to pay for anything that happens. So anyway, frustration, but, you know, we still want to be positive about it.
Well, Janice, thank you so much for your work and the efforts of HECA. And I would urge everybody to follow HECA, Hold Erie Coke Accountable, on Facebook. And is there anything that we could do to help or be doing to help?
Not at this time, though. I think letters to the editor would never hurt, absolutely. Because when we got together, one of the first things, well, in addition to meeting with community groups, we also started writing letters to the editor, and they published them, and people were often interviewed on, you know, our TV station. So the media is very interested in hearing about what's going on and being a part of promulgating the story. So certainly being involved in that way would not hurt.
Thank you. Since we have you here, do you want to ask your question that you had typed for the panel?
Which one about, well, I had written a couple of things, just
Sure.
a comment, the most recent comment that I wrote. Well, first I wrote about the radioactive waste that shocked me. But has anyone read the book, The Overstory?
It's on my list, but I haven't read it yet.
Yeah, very thick book. But as you start reading, you find out that you can't put it down. They're beautiful stories about people and their relationship to trees. And as I said in my comment, what I think was really disappointing is that we couldn't see the mountain before all the destruction, to see all the trees, everything that was torn away, not just digging into the earth, but first destroying the natural world that was there at the beginning.
I think that's one of the things about the oil sands in Canada that strikes me the most. and I think there was an image similar to this, but I've seen other images that maybe show it a little bit in more contrast. But where the trees stop and the oil stands start. And then in the other images, we didn't see the life like you're indicating, Janice. But in that one, you see exactly where it stops and the oil sands start. And I think that is incredibly striking because you can see right away what we've done.
Anyone else want to jump in?
The part in Hungary reminded me of my favorite Joni Mitchell song. They're actually putting those trees in a tree museum.
Uh-huh.
Wow.
So, you know, we're talking about the tar sands a little bit, the Dine, and there was a really wonderful line that I actually wrote down when I was watching as the Dine were driving around the mine, which is an oil mine is kind of a strange term, but that's what it is. And she said, "I don't know how they're going to reclaim underground." And this struck me because I'm a language person, right, as a writer, and that if you stay attuned throughout the film and then throughout the discourse of extractive industry to the language, it's very interesting. So they use the term overburden. They talked about it in Hungary, that overburdens the worthless rock, right? It's the burden that's over the coal. And what a terrible word, right? That we've already defined through the industrial term what matters and what doesn't. And I think a lot about this word reclaim. It's actually something was one of the big things I wrote about recently. And that reclaim has a mining term. So the Surface Mining Act in the US is about reclaiming strip mines. But there's a different way of reclaiming that the Dine we're talking about, that is to think about who it belongs to and who has the original claim and how do we restore it. And so and maybe this is, again, the English professor in me, but in all of these cases, some of our answer to recovery is to help people understand the language that they're using and how it's indicating what they are. I'm mindful of a lot of these operators, again, and one of the problems I think we face in environmental movements is that we wind up creating an antagonism, a narrative protagonist, antagonist, and often the workers are antagonists when we're trying to improve something. And then they get ground into their position because they actually care about their work and they have pride. And so if we can start shifting that and recognize that the conflict's not between those two actors and the verbs are going in different directions, we can redirect the energy of heavy equipment operators, again, like I was saying before, who I don't think they care whether they're digging a mine or digging anything else. What they don't like and don't appreciate, and I think this is correct, is like in West Virginia, everything goes back to West Virginia at some point for me, is when people say, well, we'll just reclaim them and make them computer programmers. And that's also a scam, that the people that do that actually just make the money and leave. But it's to devalue who they are as individuals too. And that's part of our problem, is even our language of opposition. And I thought there was something in that Dine comment that really opened that up usefully.
I see a lot of questions about how do we change this, or how do we change this? I think reframing the narrative is really important. I don't think, and I'm sure there are plenty of people in here that might disagree with me, but I don't think that we're getting anywhere by trying to reach people by getting them to understand how important nature is and the environment is. We all love that and we all recognize that. And I think probably most people do have somewhere inside of them where they recognize that. But that's not, talking like that is not going to move the needle. I think we need to start slowly changing the narrative. Sometimes that might happen quickly, but I think maybe you start with, we're not just talking about nature. We're not just talking about this beautiful place where we like to go for walks. We're talking about nature that is our home, and that we need to function well in order for ourselves to survive. So start speaking about how valuable the resources are. And I know a lot of environmental people hate probably talking about the environment as natural resources, and I totally understand that. But I think you maybe start with speaking their language there, you know, whoever they may be, but speaking the language that decision makers understand. And then that starts to move the needle. And then I think maybe you might start to get people to appreciate that even more when we understand it for the maybe monetary or economic value, that we can just rethink that.
Yeah, I think that's go ahead.
Okay. Sarah, what you're saying really reminds me of the way a lot of indigenous communities speak about their relationship to the earth. And you saw it a little bit in the documentary with how the earth is the soul and the mind and the body and the root of the spirit. And I think that can bring us to the term and the topic of intersectionality. And I think people often are misguided with things like climate and environmental justice and the issue of pollution, thinking that it only affects natural resources or it only affects our landscape. But the reality is that climate injustice is so rooted into social injustice, which is rooted into, you know, how this affects youth, how this affects elderly, and how it affects elderly affects how it affects migrant communities, which affects how it affects the homeless, which affects how it affects the working class, which affects how it affects the poor, and so many people of so many other different backgrounds and identifiers and identities in general. So I think maybe we start to realize how intertwined all of the injustices we face are in this world is. And I think then together, once we realize that and realize how really this issue is not exclusive to landscape or resources, but affects everybody, like hunters and fishers and people who are like LGBTQ and like everyone. Everyone is affected by this issue. And I think once that becomes really apparent to people, and once we can unmask this system of injustice and the complexity that it is, and how it's not broken, but in fact working how it was designed, we'll have an opportunity to change our culture.
Yeah. To address Jesse's question on the same subject, a way to shift our culture from indifference to conservation. You know, I kind of despair. I mean, we're all trying to do that. That's exactly what we're working to do. And this film, I think, is a dramatic presentation of what, I mean, I don't want to, no, it's a very appropriate term. It's the banality of evil. It's a term that was coined, I think, for the reference to the Holocaust. But it's the way that regular people on a daily basis go about doing things that are destroying us, that are destroying other people, and that they know are not right. But my paycheck. It's that same issue.
And I think it's Tiffany saying, it's part of that shift and like connecting all of these is helping people understand how their own paycheck is related to that in some way. So you actually have to enter at that point. Thinking back to the Coke plant we were talking about here, and then in the northern tier here, right? Gas wells are a big deal. And there's like a multi-billion-dollar state economic liability for uncapped gas wells across the Commonwealth. And that is the system. Like, there is actually no economically profitable energy company in the world if you actually would charge them for the things that they're doing, for the pollution, the loss of life, for the cleanup. And so if we could start there and talking to people that you're concerned about money and taxes, what about the multi-billion-dollar liability that the gas companies have left you? Why do you think they're not going to do that again? That gives you an entry point into speaking, as Sarah said, their language, to begin exposing the systems that are designed, as Tiffany said, exactly to do this. That, you know, the Coke or the cracker plant in the Mon Valley, Ohio Valley, is exactly that. It creates a market here for a market we don't need, and everybody signs up for it because we're broke, and that's also part of the system. We're supposed to be broke up here, so we'll do these things for the system, and that's what we need people shouting that all the time who are in positions to be paid attention to.
Well, and isn't that what they were showing, what was shown at the end of the film, where we're looking at where the oil sands began, and they just left everything.
Right.
And yeah, you have the evidence right in front of you. And I think that, again, how do we not realize this? You have the evidence in front of you, and this is going to happen again. Why do we keep falling for it? And I think it's for the we make profit now at the expense of the future.
Yeah, and then I also keep going back to the point. I had the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. I think it's the 10-year anniversary was either yesterday or the day before. And I keep thinking about how we have continuously bailed out oil companies and bailed out the fossil fuel industry, but we don't bail out workers. Like, we don't help them or bring them to a point or give them resources and materials and money and guidance to move away from those industries. Or even when crises like that happen, we aren't supporting the working class people who are really running the show and who have lost the most out of this. Instead, we are helping the corporations. And I think there's something to be said about how corporate greed can really, or has really, destroyed us.
Profit over people. Let's get to, Michaela has a last question. Let's talk about how do we repair this deconstructed earth, and then maybe we can all take last comments. And if anyone that is, anyone on our participants list wants to share a last comment or a thought on the film, just raise your hand or type me a chat and I'll unmute you too.
If I can kick off on that question, my brother, the chemist, that's something I think that's actually apt about this, and I think it's an important reframe, is that the Earth doesn't care, and the Earth will actually be fine. And that in the kind of geological time frames of the planet, we cannot hurt it. What we can hurt is us. And so what we actually have to recognize is what Barry Lopez talks about impaired creeks, is that the creeks aren't impaired, it's our relationship to them. And we have to just constantly talk about, this is about self-interest. Human beings are remarkably self-interested, and you can either destroy yourselves or not destroy yourself. And so the Earth actually is kind of irrelevant in the safety of the Earth, if that makes sense.
I agree with that, Matt. And I think, to Michaela's first question, how do we go back? We don't. We cannot go back. I think we move forward. And I think the Earth, I don't think the Earth will be fine. We certainly have changed it, and probably have changed it for, it will be fine. It will rebound, and especially when we're gone. But we certainly should move forward in a better way, for our sake, but also for the Earth's sake, to allow it to move forward, our home to move forward in a more positive way. I agree, though, that I think we're seeing that right now, right? With everyone who is staying home, and where the Earth is kind of fixing itself already. And I think we would see that on a bigger scale if we were gone even more. It would happen pretty quickly. But I don't, if anybody thinks like that, I don't think that shouldn't be the way we're thinking, right? We are people. And I think this film shows how great we can be. I mean, great in as far as how it's destructive great, but we have a lot of power, and we are very intelligent. And could we please make that into more of a positive force rather than a destructive force? And I really, truly believe that we can do that.
Anyone else? John?
Yeah, I'll go. Oh, okay.
Tiffany, go ahead.
I'll go. Yeah, I think, well, just two thoughts in my head now. I don't know. Sarah, I think I disagree with you in saying that the Earth is fixing itself now during the coronavirus period, because I don't think the answer to this solution is the cost of human lives. And I think mentalities like that can get us caught up in an eco-fascist trope, where we think the solution is something short term, but I think our solution is to go forward, but not slowly and incremental change, right? We don't need reformism, we need abolition. And from abolition, we need to reconstruct a new system for everyone, by everyone, where everyone is accounted for. And we all can move forward into a just, green society. And I think the way we do that is through the Green New Deal. And if you don't know, it's a loose set of principles and ideas that basically acknowledge where we are in the state of this climate, as well as other environmental catastrophes like pollution and etc. And it takes all of that, and it's a broad plan to move ourselves and transition our economy and the way not only our country but our world really thinks about things like commerce and jobs and healthcare and the other intersectionalities that I mentioned before, and moves us forward so that we're not living like how the United States is living right now, where we would need, like, what is the number of, I think it's like 5 or 10 Earths to live how our country lives. And I think it's solutions like that in hand with people who have been fighting this fight for so long, in hand with people of color who are environmental activists and indigenous communities who have cared for this earth for centuries upon centuries. So I think that's part of the answer, yeah.
Anyone else? Anyone from our visitors group want to add a thought on film? Otherwise, I think this has been great. I thank you all so much for being here for our first film under quarantine here on Earth Day, the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. Good discussion. You all make me hopeful. And I guess I should let you know of our upcoming events. Next Wednesday, we have a crime film called The Whistlers. And then in 2 weeks, on May 6th, we have a gerrymandering documentary called Slay the Dragon. And we will have panels after each of those as well. Thank you, everyone, so much.
Thank you, John. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, John.
Thank you all.
Fun.
Good night.
See ya.
Bye.